When I first met Ryan, he was everything I thought I wanted. He had this soft-spoken charm, the kind that didn't try too hard but still managed to linger in your thoughts long after you'd said goodbye. He wasn't loud or overly confident like the guys I'd dated before. He was quiet, thoughtful, almost fragile in a way that made me want to protect him. We met during my second year of college, in a shared art elective neither of us were supposed to take. He was studying computer science, I was majoring in literature, and yet somehow our worlds overlapped through a random drawing class on Thursday afternoons. From the very beginning, Ryan had this gentleness about him that felt different. He spoke in low tones, moved carefully, and always seemed to think twice before he acted. I remember the first time he showed me one of his sketches, a self-portrait, though he didn't say it was. It was of a person, delicate and uncertain, half-shaded as though caught between two worlds. I didn't understand it then, but something about that drawing stayed with me. Our friendship turned into something more, quietly and naturally. He'd walk me home after class, carry my books, make jokes in that dry, understated way of his. We'd stay up late talking about everything and nothing, how strange it was to feel out of place even among people who were supposed to be like us, how sometimes life felt like a play we were pretending to fit into. It was comforting to know that someone else understood. After we officially started dating, I began noticing little things about him that didn't quite add up. He had this habit of running his fingers through my hair, not absent-mindedly like most people do, but studying it, as if he was trying to imagine what it might feel like to have it himself. He'd linger in my room when I was doing my makeup, not with that usual curiosity guys have, but with a strange, quiet fascination. Once, when I caught him looking at my reflection while I was applying eyeliner, he blushed so deeply it almost broke my heart. I thought it was just shyness, maybe admiration, but it was something else. The first real sign came one rainy afternoon when I came home early from class. He didn't hear me come in, and I found him sitting on my bed with one of my scarves draped around his neck, his fingers brushing the soft fabric against his skin. There was something so vulnerable about him in that moment, like he was both terrified and at peace. I froze in the doorway, not wanting to startle him. When he finally noticed me, he went pale. "I'm sorry," he stammered, trying to untangle the scarf. "I was just curious. I didn't mean to." I didn't let him finish. I sat beside him and took his hand, gently pulling the scarf back around his neck. "You don't have to apologize," I said softly. "It looks nice on you." He stared at me like I'd just spoken in another language. There was a long silence before he whispered, "You don't think it's weird?" I shook my head. "No. Just tell me what you're thinking." He hesitated, eyes darting to the floor. "I don't know," he said. "It just feels right. But I don't know why." That was the first time I saw something shift in him, something small but real. A piece of him that had been buried for years was starting to breathe. I didn't know where it would lead, and I don't think he did either. But I knew one thing for sure. This was the beginning of something neither of us fully understood. Over the next few weeks, little moments like that became more common. He'd try on my rings when he thought I wasn't looking, or ask about the way certain fabrics felt. It wasn't about fashion or playfulness. It was deeper, more searching. One evening, while helping me pack for a weekend trip, he held one of my dresses up in front of himself, looking at his reflection in the mirror. He didn't say a word, just stared quietly, his expression unreadable. "Do you want to try it on?" I asked. He froze again, as if the idea itself was too fragile to touch. Then, almost in a whisper, he said, "Maybe just once." It was the first time he ever tried on something of mine fully. When he stepped out of the bathroom, the transformation wasn't physical, it was emotional. I saw relief in his eyes, like he'd been holding his breath his entire life and finally let it go. He didn't look ridiculous. He didn't look like he was pretending. He just looked like himself. That night, after he changed back into his own clothes, he sat on the edge of the bed and said, "I don't know what's happening to me." And I told him, "Maybe you're just finding yourself." I didn't know how true those words would become, or how much they would change both our lives. After that night, something unspoken began to grow between us. Ryan didn't bring it up again immediately, and neither did I. It wasn't avoidance exactly. It was more like we were both waiting for the right moment, the right words, something that could make sense of what we didn't yet understand. But there was no denying that the air between us had changed. Every time he looked at me, there was a question behind his eyes. Every time I reached for his hand, there was a tremor of something deeper, like we were both standing on the edge of a truth we were afraid to fall into. A few weeks later, on a quiet Sunday morning, I woke up to the sound of soft music playing from the bathroom. Ryan was in there longer than usual. When I gently knocked and asked if he was okay, his voice came back faint but calm.
Yeah.
Just give me a second. When the door finally opened, I remembered just staring. He had brushed his hair forward, in a softer style that framed his face, and there was a touch of color on his lips. Nothing bold, just a hint. He had used my tinted moisturizer, a little mascara, and one of my plain, oversized sweaters. But it wasn't the clothes or the makeup that struck me, it was the way he was standing. There was something peaceful about him, a quiet confidence I hadn't seen before. I just wanted to see, he said, his voice trembling slightly, how it would feel to look like this. And I told him, with my heart caught in my throat, "You look beautiful." He smiled faintly, but I could see the emotion behind it, the relief, the fear, the confusion all tangled together. That was the first time I saw him cry, though he tried to hide it. He kept apologizing, saying he didn't mean to make things weird, that he didn't even know what he wanted. But I could see it so clearly, he did know, he just couldn't say it yet. Over the next few months, we started exploring it more openly. It began small. He'd borrow my clothes when we were alone, learn how to apply makeup, practice walking differently, softer, more fluid. It wasn't about imitation anymore. It was about discovery. Each time he looked in the mirror, I saw more of the person he was meant to be staring back at him. We started talking late into the night about what all of it meant. One night, I finally asked him, "Do you ever feel like you were supposed to be someone else?" He hesitated for a long time. Then, in a voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it, he said, "I think I was supposed to be your sister, not your boyfriend." The words hung in the air, heavy and fragile.
I didn't know what to say.
A part of me felt my heart twist, not because I was losing something, but because I realized he had been living in pain for so long without being able to name it. When I reached for him, he flinched, not from me, but from fear. "I don't want to hurt you," he whispered. "I don't want you to think I was lying." "You weren't lying," I said. "You were surviving." He broke down, then really broke down. Every tear that fell felt like a piece of armor finally shattering. He told me about the nights he couldn't sleep, how he'd stare at his reflection and feel like it was someone else's face. How he'd prayed it would go away, how he'd tried to be the boyfriend I wanted, even when it felt like playing a role that didn't fit. We held each other for hours, saying nothing. I could feel his heartbeat against mine, trembling, uncertain. But there was a strange kind of peace too, like something sacred had been spoken aloud for the first time. In the days that followed, we talked more. About gender. About identity. About what it might mean for us, for him, for everything we thought we were. He started researching, cautiously at first, reading about hormone therapy, transition stories, the science of it all. I could see his hope growing, even though he tried to hide it behind logic and curiosity. One evening, he showed me a folder on his laptop. It was full of screenshots, before and after pictures, articles about HRT, names people had chosen for themselves. And in the middle of it all, there was a small text file, open and blinking. "What's this?" I asked. He hesitated, then said softly, "Names I've been thinking about." I read through them slowly. Names like Lily, Aaron, Sophie, and one near the bottom, half-typed and uncertain, Raina. I looked at him and smiled. "Raina," I said. "That's beautiful." He nodded, eyes glistening. "It feels like me." That was the first night I called him by that name. And when I did, I saw something in him come alive, a spark that had been dim for years suddenly glowing bright. We didn't have all the answers, not even close. But we had honesty now, and that was more powerful than anything else. I remember lying awake that night, my heart full of so many emotions I couldn't name. I knew things were changing, that our story was becoming something neither of us expected. But I also knew this. I didn't want to lose him, or rather her. Not to fear, not to shame, not to misunderstanding. Because whatever happened next, I wanted to see who Reina would become. Once the name existed, it couldn't be undone. Reina wasn't just a word anymore. It was a pulse, a quiet rhythm that began to shape our lives. It started small, like everything meaningful does. When I'd text her in the mornings, I'd sometimes type "Good morning, Reina" instead of Ryan, then quickly correct it, though I could tell she didn't mind. When we were home, I'd use it casually, testing the sound in the air, letting it find its place between us. Every time I said it, she'd soften, her shoulders loosening as though something inside her was being allowed to breathe. It wasn't easy for her to hold on to that name outside our space. Out in the world, she still had to be him. She still wore the same clothes, spoke the same way, carried the same mask that had kept her safe for years. But at home, she was free. She'd come in after class or work and quietly shed that old shell, trading jeans and hoodies for soft cardigans and leggings. It wasn't about pretending to be someone else. It was about being allowed to exist without apology. There were evenings when she'd sit in front of the mirror for hours, trying out different hairstyles, learning how to do her makeup properly, trying to recognize herself in the reflection. Sometimes she'd laugh at how uneven her eyeliner was. Sometimes she'd just stare quietly, lost in thought. I learned to just sit nearby, reading or sketching, being there without intruding. One night, she turned to me suddenly and said, "Do you ever think it's selfish to want to be someone else?" I put my book down. "It's not selfish," I said. "It's brave." She didn't answer right away. "It just feels like I'm asking the world for permission to exist. And I don't even know if I deserve it." That broke my heart a little. "You don't need permission," I said. "You deserve to be happy. That's not something you earn. It's something you're allowed to have." She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carries gratitude and fear all at once. "You really believe that?" "I do," I said. "And I believe in you." Those words seemed to change something in her. Slowly, she began to live more as herself, not just in secret. She started taking longer walks alone, wearing clothes that made her feel comfortable, even if they weren't what people expected. Once, she came home in tears because someone had given her a strange look at a cafe. But when I asked if she wanted to stop, she shook her head.
"No," she said.
"It's worth it." She started seeing a therapist who specialized in gender identity. The first few sessions left her shaken. She'd come home quiet, withdrawn, processing everything, but after a while, she began to glow in small ways. She'd tell me about her sessions, about how she was learning to understand the parts of herself she'd buried since childhood. She told me how she used to wish she could wake up one day and just be the person she saw in her dreams. And now, for the first time, that wish didn't feel impossible. One evening, she came to me with trembling hands, holding a small prescription slip. "They said I can start HRT," she whispered. I froze, my heart beating hard. We had talked about this moment for weeks, but seeing it become real was different. "Are you sure you're ready?" I asked gently. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I've never been more sure of anything." We both cried then, not from sadness, but from the weight of what it meant. It wasn't just a medical step, it was a declaration, a promise to herself. The start of a journey that would change everything. The first day she took her medication, we sat together in silence. She held the small pill in her hand like it was sacred. "It feels like the first real choice I've ever made for myself," she said. I watched her swallow it, and I realized something quietly devastating. I wasn't losing my boyfriend. I was watching someone I loved finally come home to themselves. And that, more than anything, felt beautiful. In the following weeks, changes began, subtle at first. She'd tell me her skin felt softer, her moods a little different, her reflection a little more familiar. There were days when she felt euphoric, and others when she was scared of what the world might think. But through it all, she was becoming more alive. One night, I caught her looking at herself in the mirror again, running her fingers through her hair, smiling softly. "I think I'm starting to see her," she said quietly. "The person I was supposed to be." And I said, "I've seen her all along." That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions: love, confusion, pride, fear. I knew things between us would never go back to how they were, but maybe that was the point. Maybe love wasn't about staying the same, it was about growing together, even when the path wasn't clear. The first months after Reina began her treatment moved in a rhythm that was at once slow and startlingly fast. On ordinary days, I would look at her and see the same gentle person who once drew portraits in our college art room, but then I would catch a new detail: the way her face softened, the way her eyes seemed brighter, the way her voice carried a new calmness. The changes were subtle but constant, like a tide reshaping the shore one quiet wave at a time. There were hard days too. Some mornings she woke up anxious, worrying that people would notice something different in her face or her posture. She would stare into the mirror, searching for proof that she was changing, and when she couldn't see it fast enough, her confidence would falter. Those were the mornings when we would sit together with coffee, and I would remind her that becoming yourself is not about speed, it's about honesty. She began documenting her progress in a small notebook. Every few days, she would write about her mood, her reflection, her thoughts. The entries were short, sometimes only a few sentences, but they traced a slow awakening. I smiled at myself today, or I looked in the mirror and didn't feel afraid. There was one entry I will never forget, written in delicate handwriting with a tear stain on the page. For the first time, I feel like my body is listening to me. Our relationship shifted in ways neither of us expected. We had once been a couple in the usual sense: dates, movie nights, the rhythm of romance, but now we were something different, something deeper. We became companions in truth. There was affection, yes, but it wasn't confined to labels. Sometimes I missed what we had been, but when I looked at Reina, I felt a kind of pride I had never known. She was becoming, and I was lucky enough to witness it. Friends started noticing small changes. At first, they said she looked healthier, happier. Some didn't know what was different. They just sensed something lighter about her. We kept her journey private, though, not out of shame, but because she wasn't ready to explain it to the world. Her voice had begun to change slightly, softer at the edges, her gestures more natural to her new sense of self. When she laughed, it filled the room in a way it never had before. There was one evening that remains clear in my mind. We were walking home under the early winter sky, the streets glimmering with the first snow. Reina stopped suddenly, her breath visible in the cold air, and said, "Do you think people will ever see me the way I see myself?" I thought for a long moment before answering. Eventually, yes. But the most important thing is that you already do. She smiled, her eyes shining with quiet determination. Then, that's enough for now. That night, she showed me something she had been working on, a self-portrait just like the one she had drawn years ago when we first met. But this one was different. It wasn't half-shadowed or uncertain. It was full of light, each line drawn with confidence. The person in the picture was her, Reina. When she handed it to me, she said softly, "This is the first drawing that feels honest." I hung it above her desk. Weeks passed. Her family began to notice her distance, and the tension that followed was heavy. They had always known Ryan as their quiet, reliable son, and the idea of Reina unsettled them. When she finally told them about her transition, it was through a letter, handwritten, honest, trembling with love. She waited 3 days for a reply, and those were some of the hardest days I had ever seen her endure. When the reply came, it was neither rejection nor full acceptance. Her mother wrote that she needed time, that she still loved her, but didn't understand. It hurt, but it was also a small door left open. Reina cried when she read it, not from despair, but from relief. "At least she didn't say goodbye," she whispered. The weeks that followed were a mix of healing and hope. We spent nights talking about the future, about how she wanted to change her name legally, about the possibility of moving to a city where she could live openly, about the kind of work she wanted to do. She spoke about helping others who felt the same confusion she once did. She said, "If I can make even one person feel less alone, it'll all be worth it." One morning, I woke up and found her sitting on the balcony wrapped in a blanket, watching the sunrise. When I asked what she was thinking, she said, I used to watch the sun and feel like it was rising for everyone except me. Now, for the first time, it feels like it's rising with me. There were still fears, still moments of doubt, but the difference now was that she met them with courage instead of hiding. Watching her grow into herself was like witnessing someone learn how to breathe for the first time. I began to realize that love doesn't vanish when it changes shape. It simply learns a new language. That winter turned out to be one of those slow, patient winters when everything seems to move in half-light. The city was wrapped in frost, and our apartment felt like a small cocoon. Raina kept a candle burning on the windowsill, the same scent every night, something with vanilla and cedar. She said it reminded her that change could be gentle, that growth didn't always have to be loud. Her routine became steadier. She would wake early to stretch, drink tea instead of coffee, and sometimes sit at the desk sketching while the world outside was still gray. I learned to recognize her moods by the way she drew. On good days, her lines were strong and fluid. On difficult ones, they were hesitant, searching. There were mornings she would whisper, "I'm learning how to see myself without flinching," and I would nod because I understood self-recognition is its own kind of work. By February, she had told a few close friends. The first was our classmate Ava, who listened quietly, asked thoughtful questions, and then hugged her for a long time. The next day, Ava brought over a scarf she had knitted, soft blue with small silver threads. "For Raina," she said, handing it to her. That simple gesture broke something open. For the first time, Raina cried from being seen rather than from being afraid. Little by little, the world outside our apartment began to catch up with who she was inside. She corrected her name at the clinic, then on her student records, then on the small things, library card, art submissions, email signature. Each change felt like a tiny act of revolution. "It's strange," she said one night, "how paperwork can feel like poetry." Physically, the differences were more noticeable by spring. Her skin glowed in the light, her features softer, her voice finding a new rhythm. But the most remarkable transformation wasn't visible. It was the way she carried herself, shoulders back, eyes meeting people's gazes without apology. There was a new steadiness, a quiet pride that came from surviving herself. Not everything was easy. Some people drifted away, unsure how to respond. A few old friends avoided her altogether. The first time someone misgendered her intentionally, she came home shaking, the tears silent but fierce. We sat on the floor together until she could speak. "I thought I was ready," she said, "but it still hurts." I told her that bravery isn't the absence of pain, it's the willingness to keep walking through it. She nodded and wrote those words on a sticky note above her mirror. "Keep walking." By summer, we had moved into a smaller apartment near the park. It had big windows and too much sunlight, but she loved it. She said the light made her feel visible in a good way. We spent weekends painting the walls, buying secondhand furniture, hanging her new artwork. The old self-portrait stayed, but beside it she hung the new one. Two faces of the same soul. Whenever guests visited, they would ask about them, and she would simply say, "That was before, and this is now." I began to notice how her laughter changed. It used to be hesitant, like she was waiting for permission. Now it filled the rooms easily, unguarded. She laughed while cooking, while reading, while accidentally dropping paint on the floor. It was as if every sound she made was a small celebration of freedom. We took a trip to the coast that year, just a short weekend escape. I remember standing with her on the sand, wind whipping her hair across her face. She looked out at the water and said, "For years I thought I was waiting to become someone new. But maybe I've just been uncovering who was here all along." I didn't answer. There was nothing to add. The ocean seemed to understand. When we came home, she decided to start volunteering at a local support group for young people exploring their identities. Every Tuesday evening, she would leave with her notebook and come back glowing. She said the stories she heard there reminded her that courage is contagious. "They think I'm helping them," she said once, "but really, they're helping me remember why I started." Through all of it, our connection deepened in a quieter, steadier way. We weren't girlfriend and boyfriend anymore. We were something else. Family made by choice, by care, by the kind of loyalty that survives transformation. Sometimes people would ask what we were to each other, and I would just smile and say, "We're home." As autumn approached again, I realized that almost a full year had passed since that first conversation. I remembered the scarf around her neck, the trembling voice saying, "It feels right, but I don't know why." Now she knew why. She knew who. And the knowledge didn't erase the past, it honored it. One evening, as leaves turned amber outside our window, Raina whispered, "I used to be afraid that changing would make me disappear. But I think it's done the opposite. It's made me real." And I realized that this was the heart of her journey, not of vanishing, but of becoming. The second autumn arrived quietly, as if the world itself wanted to give Raina a gentle season to test her new wings. The air smelled of rain and smoke from distant fireplaces. By then she had settled into her new rhythm, classes, the support group, sketching commissions for a small online shop she had started. From the outside, our lives probably looked ordinary, but every day still carried the quiet astonishment of having reached this far. The biggest challenge now was stepping fully into the public world as herself. Inside our home, she was Raina without question. Outside, she still had to think twice before speaking her own name. The first time she went to a job interview under her new identity, she rehearsed for hours. In front of the mirror, she adjusted her voice, practiced her handshake, planned what to say if someone questioned her documents. I watched the care she took and realized that for her, simply being seen was work. When she came home that afternoon, she dropped her bag, leaned against the door, and laughed through tears. "They called me Ms. Rivera," she said, still shaking. They didn't even blink. That small courtesy, one word, one gesture, had given her a sense of belonging no speech could match. She didn't get that particular job, but it didn't matter. For her, the real success was being addressed as who she was. A week later, she began an internship at a small design studio. The team there was young, open, curious. She told them on the first day, simply and calmly, "My name is Raina." No one asked for explanations. She came home every evening with stories about the projects she was helping with, color palettes, logo drafts, a mural they were designing for a children's hospital. "It's the first time I've worked somewhere that felt light," she said one night. "Like I can breathe while I'm there." Her family was still learning. Her mother would call once a week, sometimes slipping on the name, sometimes getting it right. Raina always forgave it gently, even when it stung. "She's trying," she said, "and that's more than I expected." Eventually, her younger sister sent her a message out of the blue. "I think Raina suits you. Love you." Raina showed me the screen with trembling hands. That one sentence meant more than any apology could. The most visible sign of her change came the day she had her official name corrected on her identification card. The envelope arrived by mail, ordinary and unceremonious. She opened it slowly, almost afraid to look. When she saw the word Raina printed there, she covered her mouth, her eyes filling instantly. "It's real," she whispered. "It's actually real." We celebrated with takeout and music, and she kept the envelope pinned to the fridge for weeks afterward as proof that her truth could live on paper. But progress came with exhaustion, too. There were days when she would come home and sink onto the couch without speaking. The world can be kind, but it can also demand endless explanations. "I'm tired of having to justify happiness," she said once. I held her hand and told her she didn't have to explain anything here. At home, the only rule was rest. During those quieter nights, she began painting again. Not portraits this time, but landscapes full of movement. Wind across grass, waves folding into themselves, trees bending without breaking. When I asked what they meant, she said, "They're about endurance." Her art grew in confidence, just as she did. Soon her small online shop turned into commissions from people who followed her story on social media. She shared her journey openly, writing posts about patience and change, about how each step forward felt both ordinary and miraculous. One post read, "I used to think transition was about becoming beautiful. Now I understand it's about becoming whole." It was shared hundreds of times. She told me it felt strange to be someone's symbol. "I'm just a person," she said, "trying to live." But she didn't close herself off. She answered messages from strangers, encouraged others to seek help, and reminded them that transformation doesn't erase the past, it illuminates it. By late winter, she was invited to speak at a small college panel about identity and art. Standing before an audience terrified her, but she went anyway. I sat in the back row, watching her steady herself at the podium. She told the story of her first self-portrait, the one that was half-shadowed, and how she learned to draw in full light. Her voice trembled at first, then grew stronger. When she finished, the room was silent for a heartbeat before the applause started. She smiled, small and genuine, and I knew she had crossed another invisible line toward freedom. That night, as we walked home through falling snow, she said quietly, "Sometimes I forget how afraid I used to be." I looked at her and thought of the boy who once held a scarf in secret, too scared to speak. "You were never just afraid," I told her. "You were brave enough to begin." The wind picked up, lifting the snowflakes between us like tiny sparks, and for a moment everything was still. The city, the night, our breath, and I thought, this is what becoming looks like. Not a single grand moment, but 1,000 small ones, layered gently over time. By the time spring came again, Raina moved with a quiet certainty that astonished even her. The mirror had stopped being an opponent, it had become an ally. She still had mornings of doubt, but they passed more quickly, replaced by the calm of routine. She would hum while brushing her hair, glance at her reflection, smile a little, and go about her day. Her life outside the apartment expanded. The design studio offered her a full-time position after graduation. Her colleagues celebrated with cupcakes and a card that read to Raina, "You make color look easy." She kept the card pinned above her desk as a reminder that she had earned every bit of this normalcy. At home, we fell into a rhythm that felt less like a household and more like a partnership in motion. We shared chores, planned meals, argued gently about which plants needed repotting. Some nights, she would sit on the floor surrounded by sketchbooks, talking about work, about people she'd met at the support group, about how small acts of kindness could change a whole day. There was an ease between us now that didn't need definition. Love had shifted into a steadier form, friendship anchored by deep respect. One evening, she came home carrying a small box. "A surprise," she said, placing it on the table. Inside was a simple silver pendant engraved with a sunrise. "For you," she said. "Because you stayed when things were darkest."
I didn't know what to say.
We sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that means everything. But not all days were luminous. There were still moments when the past caught up, letters addressed to her old name, the occasional stranger's stare, an unkind remark that landed like a bruise. She learned to breathe through them, to let them go. "They don't get to tell my story," she said once, her voice steady. Her relationship with her family continued to thaw. That summer her mother visited for the first time since everything changed. I remember watching from the kitchen as they hugged awkwardly at first, then tightly. Her mother's voice cracked when she said, "You look happy." And Raina replied simply, "I am." They spent the weekend cooking old recipes, laughing over childhood stories, bridging the distance one meal at a time. When her mother left, she kissed her cheek and said, "See you soon, Raina." It was the first time she had said the name without hesitation. After that visit, something in Raina relaxed. She began to talk about long-term plans, wanting to move to a place with a small garden, maybe adopt a cat, maybe teach art workshops. She spoke of the future the way people speak of spring, as if it were inevitable. There was a day late that summer when we went hiking in the hills outside the city. At the top, wind rushing through the grass, she turned to me and said, "Do you ever think about how many versions of us there have been?" I laughed and said, "Too many to count." She nodded. "I think that's the best part. We keep finding new ones." That night, back at the apartment, she found the old drawing she'd made when we first met, the half-shaded portrait that had started everything. She studied it for a long time, then tucked it into a portfolio. "It's not who I am anymore," she said softly, "but it deserves to be remembered." Her confidence drew people in. The support group invited her to help mentor new members, and she agreed. Every week she came home with stories, someone who had just come out, another who had started their first day on hormones, a parent who wanted to learn. They remind me why I have to keep showing up, she said. Visibility isn't about being brave all the time. It's about letting someone else see what's possible. I watched her become a steady presence in other people's lives, and it filled me with quiet awe. The same person who once whispered apologies for existing now stood in front of rooms full of strangers, speaking about authenticity and art and hope. One evening, after one of those meetings, she told me about a young person who had thanked her. They said seeing me talk made them believe they could grow up, she said, eyes shining. I never thought I'd be that person for someone. I told her, you already are. She smiled, thoughtful. Then I have to keep earning it. The days stretched into late summer, the city glowing with heat, and I realized that the transformation I'd witnessed wasn't only hers. Living beside someone learning to be honest changes you too. I had learned patience, humility, the art of listening. I had learned that identity is not a single revelation but a long conversation with yourself. Sometimes, when the evening light poured through the window, I would catch her reflection next to mine in the glass. Two people who had crossed a long road together, still side by side, still learning. There was no old version to return to, no neat ending waiting ahead, only a continued unfolding. And, in that quiet realization, everything felt right. The third year began almost without us noticing. There was no single moment that marked its arrival, only the way time seemed to settle around us like a soft coat. Reina's life had expanded again. New friends from work, weekend painting classes she taught at the community center, a small cat with one torn ear that decided our apartment was its home. She named him Pippin. He followed her everywhere, curling beside her sketchbooks, as if guarding her peace. The rhythm of our days became ordinary in the best sense of the word. I would wake to the smell of her tea, the rustle of paper as she planned lessons, the sound of the city waking below. She still talked to me about her fears, but they were different now, less about survival, more about direction. I've built a new life, she said once, and now I have to figure out what to do with it. She began a series of paintings called The Weight of Light. Each canvas showed people caught between shadow and glow, half in the world, half finding it. She said they were portraits of transformation, not of gender, but of courage. When she exhibited them at a small local gallery, the room filled with quiet emotion. I watched people stand before her work and fall silent, as if recognizing something familiar inside themselves. That night, she sold 3 pieces. She didn't celebrate loudly. She just sat on the floor afterward, smiling, whispering, "They saw me." There were challenges still. Some days she fought exhaustion from medication changes, or the sharp sting of a comment online. The more visible she became, the more opinions people had. "I don't want to be a headline," she told me. "I just want to be a person." We talked about how visibility can be both gift and burden, how the same light that warms can also expose. She handled it the way she handled everything, by returning to small kindnesses, by grounding herself in the real world. When it all became too heavy, she'd take Pippin to the park and draw the trees. Around that time, her mother visited again, this time with her sister. They came bearing homemade cookies and awkward affection, but it was progress. The visit went better than any of us expected. Her mother watched her paint, listened to her stories about students, and by the end of the weekend said quietly, "You seem at peace, sweetheart." The old name was gone from her vocabulary now. That simple shift, no speeches, no ceremony, felt monumental. As months passed, Reina's artwork and writing began to reach further. She was invited to contribute an essay to a book about identity and creativity. I helped her edit it, though she hardly needed help. The essay was titled Living in the In-Between. In it she wrote, "Becoming myself did not erase who I was. It gave me the language to love that person too." When the book was published, she held it like something fragile and sacred. One evening, as we were cleaning the kitchen, she asked, "Do you ever miss the old US?" I thought for a moment. Sometimes, I admitted. But I think what we have now is stronger.
She nodded.
I think so too. You saw me through both versions. Not everyone gets that. There was tenderness in that acknowledgement, an unspoken gratitude that stretched between us. Our relationship had evolved beyond categories. We were not the same people who had started this journey, but the thread connecting us had only grown steadier. When autumn came again, the gallery that had hosted her earlier show invited her to do another, this one a solo exhibition. She hesitated at first, afraid she wasn't ready, but she said yes. The show opened on a chilly Friday evening. People crowded the room, the air thick with the smell of paint and anticipation. Her new collection was different, softer, more open, each canvas carrying warmth instead of struggle. At the center hung one large painting, a portrait of light spilling through a window onto a figure turning toward it. The plaque read simply, Self-Portrait, 2025. As she stood beside it, people approached to congratulate her, to thank her, to tell her what her work meant to them. I watched her listen with grace, her smile calm, her posture confident. She had become someone who could stand in her own light without flinching. After the gallery closed, we walked home under the streetlights. She was quiet, thoughtful. "It's strange," she said finally. "When I first started this, I thought the goal was to feel complete. But maybe it's about staying open instead." "Open to what?" I asked. "To whatever comes next," she said. "To becoming again in new ways." We reached our building, and she paused at the door, looking up at the night sky. "You know," she added, "for a long time I thought transition was a destination. But it's really just another beginning." Inside, Pippin greeted us with a soft meow, winding around her legs. She laughed, scooping him up. The sound of her laughter filled the room like sunlight. I realized that the person before me, the one who had once been uncertain, who had once hidden in shadows, was now radiant in her own quiet strength. She had carried herself through storms, and somehow, she had carried me too. Winter came again, softer this time. The snow no longer felt like a wall between her and the world. It felt like the world's slow breath, something she could walk through instead of hide from. Reina's days were full. Work at the studio, her students at the community center, evenings spent painting by the glow of a small lamp. The cat snored on a pile of sketchbooks while I read across the room. Life had become ordinary in a way that felt like victory. She told me once, "I used to think belonging was something people gave you. Now I think it's something you build." She was right. Every habit, every new friend, every piece of art added another brick to that house of belonging. She kept a jar on her desk labeled Moments I Stayed. Inside were slips of paper, small notes like "spoke up for myself at work" or "laughed in public without shrinking." By the end of the year, the jar was nearly full. That January, she organized an exhibit for her students. They were nervous teenagers, each with their own quiet storms, but she guided them gently. At the opening, she stood aside while they explained their pieces to visitors, beaming with pride. Afterward, one of them handed her a small drawing, a bright figure walking through fog toward light. "You taught us to see ourselves," the student said. She cried in the car on the way home, not from sadness, but from recognition. "They're going to be okay," she whispered. Her art began to travel further than we expected. A magazine interviewed her about identity and design. She talked not about labels, but about the discipline of honesty, how every brushstroke is a decision to tell the truth. When the article came out, messages poured in from strangers. One line kept being quoted: "Becoming yourself is not about changing everything. It's about stopping the fight against what has always been true." Amid all the success, she still had quiet days of doubt. Once, while preparing a new series, she stared at a blank canvas and said, "What if this is all I am? Just the story of change?" I reminded her that every artist is the story of change, that art itself is transformation. She smiled at that, picked up her brush, and began again. Her mother visited often now. They would cook together, swapping recipes and memories. One night, while washing dishes, her mother said softly, "I don't know if I'll ever fully understand, but I see that you're free." Reina reached over, wet hands and all, and hugged her. That moment was a bridge that no longer needed words. Spring returned, and we took another trip to the coast. The the same place where she once said she was uncovering herself. The water was calm that day. We sat in silence for a long time, the air smelling of salt and beginnings. She turned to me and said, "Do you ever think about the first time you saw me like this?" "All the time," I admitted. She smiled. "Sometimes I forget that I used to be afraid of mirrors. Now, I just see a person who made it through." When we came home, she decided to frame her old sketches, even the uncertain ones. "They're part of the map," she said. She hung them in the hallway in chronological order, a quiet timeline of courage. Walking past them each morning became a kind of prayer, a reminder that growth is never wasted. As summer warmed the city, she started planning an art book combining her paintings and journal entries. The working title was The Shape of Belonging. She wanted it to be about more than transition. She wanted it to be about endurance, kindness, and finding home inside your own skin. I helped her sort through hundreds of photos and notes, the two of us laughing at old memories, crying over the hard ones. It was like reliving the whole journey through different eyes. When the first printed copy arrived months later, she opened the box carefully, as if it were alive. The cover showed one of her paintings, a figure standing in sunlight, eyes closed, arms open. She ran her fingers over the title and whispered, "This is everything I couldn't say out loud." She signed my copy with a single line, "For the one who never looked away." That night, as we sat on the balcony watching the lights of the city, she said, "You know, people always ask what it feels like to change. I think the better question is how it feels to stay." She glanced at me, smiling. "You stayed. I did too. That's the miracle." I thought about all the versions of us. Every conversation, every fear, every fragile beginning, and I understood. Staying had been the hardest part, but also the truest. The fifth spring came quietly, without ceremony. By then, the story of Reina's becoming had folded itself into everyday life. There were no more firsts to count, no more hurdles waiting just beyond the next sunrise. The transformation had become less of a journey forward and more of a way of being, a rhythm that felt natural, unforced, whole. She was now teaching full-time, her classes filled with students who came not only to learn about color and form, but about courage. They listened when she spoke, not because she demanded attention, but because she had that rare kind of calm that draws you in. Sometimes I'd visit her studio and find her sitting cross-legged on the floor, explaining how light can reveal the soul of an object. They didn't know, most of them, what she had been through to understand that. They only saw the result, someone luminous, alive, and utterly at ease with herself. At home, her life was simple and full. There were shelves of sketchbooks and books about art, a small collection of seashells from our coastal trips, and a calendar covered in scribbled reminders. Call Mom, water plants, pick up frames. Pippin, older now, ruled the apartment from his favorite chair. The days flowed like an easy song. Sometimes she would look at me with that gentle half-smile and ask, "Do you remember when I thought I'd never get here?" "I remember," I'd say. She'd nod, thoughtful. "It feels like another lifetime. But I think that person still lives somewhere inside me," whispering thank you. There was one day that stood out that year. The community center hosted a large exhibition featuring artists who explored identity and transformation. Reina was asked to give the opening talk. I stood at the back of the room, watching her step up to the microphone, a small tremor in her hands that vanished as soon as she began to speak. She didn't talk about transition or labels or definitions. She talked about truth, about how the simplest act, wearing the clothes that feel right, using your real name, looking in the mirror and smiling back, can be a revolution of kindness. She said, "The hardest part of becoming yourself isn't changing. It's believing that you were worthy of change in the first place." The room went still. When she finished, the applause felt like a wave breaking and washing through everyone there. Afterward, as we walked home, she was quiet. The city lights reflected in her eyes. "I think that was the last piece," she said softly. "Not the end, just the piece that makes the rest make sense." Later that night, she sat at her desk and opened her journal. I watched her write a single line before closing it again. When I asked what it said, she smiled. "It's not for now," she said. "It's for the next version of me." In the months that followed, her book The Shape of Belonging gained attention beyond what either of us expected. Schools invited her to speak. Her story began to ripple outward, inspiring people she'd never meet. But she never let it turn into a performance. "I don't want to be anyone's symbol," she told me. "I just want to remind people that peace is possible."
Peace.
That was the word that described her best now. She no longer needed to prove, to explain, to fight. The woman who once trembled at her reflection now walked through the world unguarded, soft but unbreakable. And somehow, that peace touched everything around her, our friends, her students, her family, me. One evening, near the end of summer, we returned to the coast one last time. The sky was streaked with gold, the sea calm as glass. We sat on the same rocks where, years before, she had whispered that she was uncovering herself. Now she was simply there, whole, unhidden. The wind moved through her hair, the sun caught her face, and she looked out over the horizon for a long time before speaking. "I used to think transformation was about becoming someone new," she said. "But it's really about remembering who you've always been and finally giving that person a chance to live." The words hung in the air like a prayer. We didn't speak again for a while. There was nothing left to add. As the sun dipped below the water, I realized that her journey had never been just about her. It was about everyone who had ever looked at themselves and wondered if they were allowed to change, if they were allowed to belong. Watching her there, I knew the answer. Yes. Yes, we all are. When we drove home that night, the sky was clear, the road long and open. She rested her head against the window, eyes half closed, the faintest smile on her lips. The radio played a soft song neither of us knew, and for once, there was no need to talk about what had been or what was to come. Everything that mattered was already here. At the next red light, she turned to me and said quietly, "Thank you for staying." And I said, "Thank you for becoming." The light turned green. The city spread out ahead of us, bright and alive, the quiet horizon stretching forward into forever.